Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to this webinar. My name is Mark Maloney, and I'm the Acting Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs here at Sciences Po. It's my great pleasure to say a few brief words before this event starts, and let me do so by starting with to welcome Werner Hoyer, who's here live in the Sciences Po studio. Thank you for being with us today. This event has been a long time in the making, having first been scheduled for March 2020, when the terrible pandemic, of course, came along and began to throw all our lives into various states of disruption. So it's a great pleasure to finally welcome you to our school today. Of course, the landscape has changed, and we're doing it by Zoom rather than in one of our amphitheaters, which of course would have been our preferred way of doing so. But we've learned over the course of the last year that webinars actually can be a very effective way to reach students and indeed a wider audience in this way. So it's not necessarily a lesser experience, but a different one. Let me also warmly welcome Howard Davies, who joins us from London and who will chair today's event. Greetings, Howard. Werner, today's event builds on a long-standing relationship between Sciences Po and the European Investment Bank, a partnership which has grown impressively since 2015, perhaps most notably with the EIB's support for the creation of a new European Chair for Sustainable Development and Climate Transition at Sciences Po last year. The EIB Institute is one of 3 sponsors of the chair, hosted jointly by PSIA and the School of Public Affairs. Let me take this opportunity to thank you and the EIB for helping make this very important initiative possible. The activities of the chair, led by Professor Shiv Somshwar, who is establishing a wide ecosystem of actors to advance education, innovation, and public dialogue for the design and practice of policies in sustainable development and climate transition within and outside of Europe. I know how much everyone is looking forward to hearing from you, so let me hand over immediately to Howard, who's an esteemed professor of practice at PSIA and chairman of the NatWest group, who's going to chair today's session. Howard, the floor is yours.
Werner Hoyer. Let me say just a word or two about him before I give him. He's an economist by training from Cologne University, and I can tell you, and this shouldn't embarrass either of us, that he was born in a very good year, 1951. And I speak from personal experience. The fact that he's much younger than me by over 9 months, actually. He's younger than me. But he spent 25 years in the Bundestag for the Free Democrats in Germany, including 2 stints as State Secretary, Minister of State in the Auswärtiges Amt, the German Foreign Service, under both Helmut Kohl and then later under Chancellor Merkel. So he was, in fact, way back involved in the decision that the Germans made to join the Euro and to launch the Euro. But he's been at the EIB since 2012, and 4 years ago was elected to a second 6-year term, which was clearly a tribute to his successful tenure in that position. At the EIB, he has championed cohesion investment, which of course is one of the main tasks of the EIB, and has had a major impact on the development of the most recent accession countries in particular. He's also championed the circular economy idea, both in terms of direct project financing by the bank, but also as a catalyst for private investment. That's a characteristic of what the EIB has done over the years. The stakes in the circular economy, I think, are quite high, and they have said at the EIB that if you can apply successful circular economy strategies in cement, aluminium, steel, plastics, and food, you could eliminate half of all emissions from goods manufactured. So that's a very important initiative. I'm sure he'll say something about that later. The bank is also, at the moment, very closely involved in COVID recovery. Of course, there's the new European New Generation Fund, which has been launched, and at the EIB, they're particularly involved in channeling support to SMEs, already generating investment of over 11 billion euros as a result of their activities there. And he said at in a recent speech, rather interesting speech at the Committee of the Regions, that we can't afford a K-shaped recovery. Those of you who followed this debate among economists will know that initially we talked about a V-shaped recession from COVID. Then some people said, well, it could well be a W-shaped recession, as we had a recovery last year and then another set of lockdowns, slightly different in different places, but similar profile. And now people say, well, we may well have a K-shaped recovery, which he describes as one where we fall together, but only a few recover immediately, and one where many face long-lasting and damaging consequences. And it's clear that the EIB plans to play a big part in trying to avoid that, and crucially, to help Europe build back greener to a more sustainable future. And his title for today clearly points us in that direction. It's a privilege to have Dr. Hoyer at the PSIA, and I look forward to hearing from him on these and no doubt other subjects. But before I hand over to him, I just want to say one thing to those who are on the call. There will be plenty of time for questions after he has spoken, so start thinking about what you want to ask now, so that we don't have that sort of pause while people think of questions and then they all come in right at the end. So with that, let me hand over straight away to Werner Hoyer once again. Welcome to PSIA and Sciences Po.
Professor Davies, Professor Maloney, dear students, thank you very much for inviting me to Sciences Po, an old dream coming true today. I'm very sad that I cannot be with you today in person due to the circumstances, but there will be an opportunity soon, and I can already say now I invite you all to come to Luxembourg, maybe at least get a busload full of people and look at one of the last undetected treasures of the European integration process. I started my professional life in academia, and it was said, in Cologne, Germany, and afterwards in development, and then I went into politics, mainly in the foreign affairs development sphere. Later, I returned then to my old hobby and passion for economics, and then to bank and credit. But universities will always have a special place in my heart. As a test of your wits, there is nothing like facing hundreds of students in a crowded auditorium. Not only because of the intellectual electricity in the air, but also because you can see immediately if your ideas are stimulating by counting how many at the back are already sleeping. It is one of the many things we have lost in our virtual lives now, and perhaps that is a good thing. That will be for you to judge this afternoon from the safety of your homes. If there are no questions at the end of my speech, I will know why. Tonight, I want to take the opportunity to enlarge your knowledge of the European Investment Bank and its place in Europe. As this is the School of International Affairs, I will do so with a special focus on the EIB's activities outside of the EU, by talking about the common challenges we Europeans face in the world, by sketching out ways in which the bank can contribute to meeting these challenges. And before doing that, however, some words of introduction. Because, let's be honest, some of you, a few maybe, may not be too familiar with the bank until recently, probably one of Europe's best-kept secrets. The EIB is one of the original institutions of the European Union established by the Treaties of Rome. We are 100% owned by the EU member states. Hence, we are also sometimes known as the Bank of the European Union, or in short, the EU Bank. Like the European Commission and the Council of Ministers, we started work in 1958, all in Brussels at that time. 10 years later, we moved over to Luxembourg, because in Luxembourg, you have this concentration of everything that has to do with money and the law. Our mission is set out in the treaty and on paper at least has not changed much. It has and still is to contribute to Europe's balanced development by financing projects. So we are not financing states or budgets, we are financing projects only. In reality, the bank's activities have evolved and are constantly evolving along with Europe's priorities. From post-war reconstruction and economic development in the 60s, to building Europe's energy security in the 70s, to financing the infrastructure that underpins the single market in the 80s, and preparing the EU and the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe for enlargement in the 90s. Since 2000, the year of Europe's Lisbon Agenda, adopted during the previous Portuguese EU presidency, we have had a special focus too on financing education, research, and innovation. Lending in these areas now accounts for around a quarter of our activities inside the European Union. For many years, the bank went quietly about its business from its headquarters in Luxembourg. All that changed, however, with the financial crisis in 2008. Since then, the volume of our activity has grown significantly, and we were a key part of the EU's policy responses, first to alleviate the credit crunch, then to help it to recover from the Eurozone debt crisis by supporting additional investment through the so-called Juncker Plan, the investment plan for Europe, named after the former president of the European Commission, who invented that thing, by the way, together with me on the 9th floor of our building in Luxembourg. Today, the EIB commits about 65 billion euros of financing a year to projects that underpin EU priorities, be those in transport, energy, education, or environment. In addition, our subsidiary, the European Investment Fund, established in 1995, provides around 10 billion euros to help small and medium-sized companies get access to finance from startups to mid-caps. To bring this closer to home, if this morning you took a shower or had a glass of water from your tap in Paris, took a tram or one of RATP's electric buses, used Skype or listened to Spotify, you will have been benefiting in part from the past EIB group financing. These are all EIB projects. Right now, we are supporting construction of the future Metro Line 15, to which we are lending over 2 billion euros of loans, making the project one of the biggest ever financial commitments of our bank. Some of our activity is underpinned by guarantees we receive from the EU budget. For instance, when it comes to particularly high-risk projects, but which are in the public interest, and most of our activity outside the European Union. However, all the finance we provide is first raised on capital markets by selling bonds to investors around the world. So we need to go to the capital markets every year to sell bonds for between 60 and 90 billion euros, depending on the reflows that come in. You may have read about our recent pioneering digital bond issue together with the help of the Bank of France on the Ethereum blockchain, or heard that it was the EIB that issued the first ever green bond in 2007, a market that is today worth about 1 trillion euros and where we are still one of the key issuers. Either way, what this means is that unlike the EU budget, we are not spending taxpayers' money, but money that we raise in the capital markets. As a consequence, we need the trust of the investors. And everything we finance has to make economic sense because our investors expect to be repaid. We therefore take a lot of care to assess projects before we commit to them. This is the job of the bank's engineers, economists, and specialists who also check that everything we do is in line with EU policies. Some people consider us an engineering bank. But that's enough history for now. In the time that's left, I want to turn to the present and the challenges that Europe faces now and in the years to come. To frame this part of my lecture, let me start with what you might want to call the paradox of Europe. What I mean by this is the fact that while the role of Europe in securing our way of life is as important as ever, public support for the European project is low. Let me explain. Roughly 26 years ago, Chancellor Helmut Kohl asked me, to my big surprise at that time, to become Minister of State for European Affairs in the Foreign Office and the coordinator of European policies in the Cabinet. Helmut Kohl had the opportunity to appoint someone to represent Germany in the so-called reflection group that was to prepare the Treaty of Amsterdam. This was the next major European treaty after Maastricht, and therefore very strongly a matter for the Chancellor. I was, of course, flattered by the offer and found the idea to immerse myself in questions regarding the future of Europe fascinating. A key takeaway that I still remember from this time is that at the end of the day, European integration is nothing less than the organization of our self-assertion as Europeans in an ever more globalized world. And as you can imagine, this is why I agree with President Emmanuel Macron so much when he's talking about strategic autonomy of the Europeans. We need to get our act together. I believe that this insight still bears a lot of relevance today. In fact, if there is one thing that I criticize, it is that we have somewhat lost track of it in recent years and that we conduct European policy often in a rather unstrategic way. After all, we have to ask ourselves, how should we as French or Polish, Germans, position ourselves between the great powers going forward, the United States, China, Russia? Others like India will follow. We must not underestimate them. Emmanuel Macron's phrase, which he borrowed from the former Belgian Prime Minister Paul-Henri Spaak, comes to mind in this context. There are only two types of states in Europe: small states and states that have not yet noticed that they are small as well. Only by pulling together will Europe be in a position to preserve its place in the world, our freedom and our way of life. It's not only about economics, it's about values. In total contrast to this, and very surprising on first sight, we see that Eurosceptic parties have gained a considerable political importance throughout the European Union in recent years. Worst of all, and most worrying for the future, is it is often young people that appear more easily to lose faith and interest in the European project. Perhaps some of you are tempted by these siren voices. The Europe you have grown up is indeed not perfect. Integration has much unfinished business. Some made this frustrating, though I hope more of you will bring your energy, enthusiasm, and compassion to completing the project. Yet still, we have to ask ourselves, how do these two things go together? An ever-increasing need to work together to preserve our welfare and freedom in a world in which nearly 80% of the global population live in illiberal or autocratic regimes, and rising Euroscepticism. To me, the answer lies in the fact that necessity does not equal strength. While the European Union is a precondition to preserve our prosperity, freedom, and values, to harness popular support, it also needs to deliver on the project, on the promise. And this is where we have fallen short for some time now. Many agree that we need to stick together to promote our competitiveness and interests globally, but few actually work towards that aim, hoping for some sort of invisible hand that will take care of this, or even worse, that another crisis will force us to shape what is the European Union. We need to overcome this standstill and tackle the challenges we face head-on, both inside the EU as well as globally. What are our domestic challenges today? There are many. Let me just name three. First, weak growth combined with rising asset prices, especially real estate. Second, the feeling some have in Europe of being left behind, inequality. And third, the fight against climate change. It would go too far to go into detail on all of them now, so let me just say this. All of these challenges have one thing in common. We will not overcome them as long as we do not manage to trigger more investments, especially in digitalization, innovative technologies, and in structurally weak regions. For years, Europe has been lagging behind in this respect. In fact, it has been over 15 years now that we have invested every single year around 1.5% or percentage points of GDP, or 50% together, less in research, development, and innovation than our main competitors in the US, China, and South Korea. This has had a significant negative effect on our productivity growth. It has led to a slowdown in economic convergence in Europe because it was often in the weakest regions where investments in innovation were cut most, and it had reduced our capacity to address major societal challenges like climate change. Take the following as an illustration. The International Energy Agency estimates that CO2 emissions fell about 8% last year thanks to the massive COVID-related shutdowns. If we are to hold the global temperature increase to 1.5%, as we have set ourselves as a target, then they must fall by this margin every year in the next decade. It is clear that we cannot achieve that by relying on forced behavior changes, more shutdowns, and existing business models and technologies. The economic and social costs would be devastating. Instead, what we need is massive investments in new technologies. And the good news is, there also lies a great opportunity in this. Think about it. Today, a group of countries representing half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions have adopted net zero targets. Others will surely follow. They will all need technology and investment to get there. Clean hydrogen, offshore renewable energy, energy storage solutions, therefore, all can become vibrant EU export sectors. Now, what do we have to do to unlock this investment? Our starting position is actually rather good. Whether telecoms, robotics, or synthetic biology, the technical revolution is in full swing. Artificial intelligence, cloud computing, 5G, soon 6G, and the Internet of Things will lead to further technological leaps in the coming years. If we invest well, these technologies could help us strengthen Europe's economic position, create jobs, and at the same time help us become emission neutral by 2050. But I said could deliberately. First, of course, we have to end the current pandemic. Until we have beaten the virus by vaccinating a large part of the global population, there will be no investment and durable recovery, but merely an economy in a perpetual start-stop mode. The EU Bank is contributing to this overarching challenge, both by helping fund the development of vaccines, medication, and diagnostics, and under the umbrella of the EU's Team Europe initiative, their distribution around the world. We provided a 100 billion euro loan very early last year for BioNTech, for its vaccine, which they produce and sell via the Pfizer channels, because we had already worked with the company before. That was a huge coincidence, and we were very lucky, because we had known that company for their technology. They applied for their cancer medication for years, and over years we had already financed that development. And when they came at a time when I didn't know how to spell COVID-19 correctly to us and say, maybe we can apply our newly detected technology also to a potential help against COVID-19, then we immediately jumped on that boat and were the first and led the crowds. We're also supporting the efforts of CureVac and many others to develop vaccines and manufacturing capacity in Europe. And we have helped pre-finance Europe's contribution to the COVAX Global Vaccine Facility that is aimed at providing equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines in every country in the world. We're talking about Europe's investment needs, I say could also, because the end of the pandemic will bring the bill. EU governments have everywhere extended unprecedented support to affected companies and sectors. Budget deficits have exploded everywhere. It is clear that the public sector as a whole will emerge weaker financially from the pandemic than it was before. The 700 billion euro next generation plan of the European Union, with its focus on climate action and digitalization, will go some way to covering the public spending gap in the next couple of years. But set against investment needs exceeding 300 billion euros a year just to modernize the energy sector, public sector spending is not going to be enough to achieve all we need. If we want to see the huge amounts of investment happening that are required to complete our green and digital transitions and not risk Europe falling even further behind its competitors, we must find ways to mobilize the private sector. What our loan officers are currently seeing in this respect is not encouraging. Many firms are cutting back their investment activities, in particular in the area of digitalization and clean tech. For them, short-term viability through deleveraging trumps investments in long-term competitiveness. While understandable from an individual point of view, given the uncertainties brought about by the pandemic, the consequence is that while we are likely to see a rebound in GDP growth in the second half of the year, aggregate investment activities may remain weak for years to come. So we must counteract urgently. We simply cannot afford another lost decade in terms of investment and innovation. And there is such a contradiction there that really worries me. We have an investment survey of 17,000 European companies of all sizes, sectors, and nationalities. And in this survey, it becomes crystal clear that companies see the need to invest more in order to catch up. The second question in the same survey is, what are your intentions for 21 and 22? And the vast majority of these companies say, well, we will be forced to cut down, to reduce costs, and in particular, reduce investments into innovation. This contradiction will cost us dearly. We simply cannot afford another loss of a decade of investment and innovation. To this end, it will be crucial we improve our economic framework conditions in Europe. The best European growth policy is and remains the completion of and strengthening of the internal market. Whereas the US and China each have a single digital market of huge dimensions and a common capital market each, we have 27 in Europe. That is an enormous competitive disadvantage. And the same could be said about energy and services. We also need more innovators, like some of you may be, with the entrepreneurial spirit to tackle the current challenges. Only they can provide the decisive impetus to change course. And we need an economic policy that helps companies and entrepreneurs to implement their innovative investment plans, even under difficult circumstances. What I mean by this is that the public sector, rather than just pushing public investment, should look for ways to incentivize private firms to invest more. At the EIB, we have made the experience that by covering part of firms' investment risk, a relatively small amount of public money can actually do wonders in catalyzing private investment activities. We have used this type of financing, for example, to successfully unlock private investment in the first floating wind farm in Portugal, which is an amazing new technology. that enables offshore wind farms to be located in deep waters where the wind is better and stronger, but where it's not possible to secure the turbines to the sea floor. As well as the first European lithium-ion battery factory in Sweden and many others, highly innovative projects all across Europe. What is important in all these cases is that the risk sharing always pursues a clear policy objective without, however, prescribing the way to get there. We need to be technology neutral. In practice, this means that at the EU Bank, we finance, for example, development of battery electric cars as well as fuel cell vehicles. We do not put all the eggs into one basket. Both approaches can make sense. We leave it up to the companies to decide which path they want to pursue. We will co-finance if the overall concept is right. So much about tackling our domestic challenges. Now let me turn to the question of what it takes for the EU to also deliver on its promise at the global stage. The answer to this is relatively straightforward. If a key value of the EU lies in its ability to put its economic weight behind its interests and values, then we also need to enable it to do so. To date, the truth is that very few governments are willing to give up their competence when it comes to matters of foreign affairs. And even where the EU has competence, we rarely make use of it. Just think of the example of economic sanctions, where the unanimity rule means that member states are often played out against each other. The result is that our continent may often be right on the global stage, but it is rarely relevant, and this matters. It's about relevance. Just think about the fight against climate change, a matter that is particularly close to my heart and that of the EIB. We have unilaterally stopped financing coal power generation in 2014, and in 2019 announced as the first and so far only multilateral development bank in the world an end to our support for all fossil fuels, including gas. The EU accounts for less than 10% of global emissions. So whatever we achieve at home will not be enough to stop catastrophic warming. When Africa's population forecast to double by 2050, it is quite obvious that our climate goals will literally go up in smoke if we allow the neighboring continent to plug its growing energy demand with electricity from coal and gas-fired power plants. And not only our climate goals. Climate change will bring more competition for scarce resources such as water and arable land. The potential for conflict and instability will rise, and along with it, the potential for huge movements in population. And by the way, the same goes for other important regions of the world, such as Latin America and Asia. We must therefore convince our global partners to embrace our ambition for all our sakes, and we must push or help them to take the necessary action. We cannot always rely on others to do so for us. This past 4 years have been a stark reminder of this. Now, Joe Biden has set America on a different path. But in climate policy, as in other areas of strategic importance, Europe's capacity to act should not depend on the electoral cycle in the US. Of course, we need to do whatever we can to rebuild and strengthen the transatlantic teamwork that has ensured peace and prosperity for such a long time. But we should engage in this framework on an equal footing with our American partners. And we do have the tools to make a difference globally. As one of the world's largest markets and trading blocs, the EU has the power to set rules and standards for imported goods and services. We have already a wide range of trade agreements and strategic partnerships with countries and regions around the world, and together the EU and its member states are the world's leading donor of development and humanitarian assistance. Finally, with the EIB, the EU has also the largest multilateral lender at its disposal, by the way, a multiple in size, for example, to the World Bank, that is willing to promote the EU's values globally. We need to make use of all these levers. Indeed, for the EIB, this discussion is not an academic one. The bank has been the EU's development bank for nearly 6 decades now. It has a truly global footprint. In the last 10 years, we have signed operations in 120 countries outside of the EU, with a particularly strong focus on Africa. Our development activities support the achievement of EU objectives, including the EU's climate agenda and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. When we decided to phase out our support for fossil fuels, and in particular for gas in 2019, this was against the strong opposition of the Trump administration at the time. But because we are EU, we could still go ahead with our new energy lending policy and so set a strong signal of EU leadership at the global stage. Other than its EU ownership, a key strength of the bank's activities outside of the EU is its unique financial, scientific, and engineering expertise. This is obvious in the area of climate action, where the bank, as I said, has been and continues to be a global pioneer, but matters also in other areas such as life sciences. In this expertise, it is this expertise which is in enormous demand in many lower-income countries and middle-income countries. And it is this engineering and banking expertise sharpened within the EU that I am convinced will be the key to boosting the EU's global standing in the years to come. That is also why I have put forward to our shareholders, that are the EU member states, a reform of the EIB's development financing activities recently, with the aim to further boost the EU's impact and visibility abroad. Visibility too, because when we say we are the biggest provider of development assistance around the world, the sad fact is also that nobody knows that. The time for the EU to act and show its value is now. And this brings me almost to the end of this talk. The European project has been a source of peace, prosperity, and freedom for many years and decades. 1946, Konrad Adenauer, former and first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, said, "I am a German and will remain a German, but I've always been a European too, and have felt as such." His words had a profound influence on many people, including my parents. His core belief was that we are Europeans first, and Germans, French, Spaniards second. It's still a great inspiration for me today. Borders and walls within Europe have never created security, never. It is a united Europe that has bestowed peace and prosperity each member state and its people. And also the future challenges facing each and every one of us, I'm convinced, can only be met by working together. We have experienced now over a decade of uncertainty. First came the global financial crisis, later the debt crisis, and now COVID. We better get used to uncertainty. We cannot simply rule out uncertainty, but we need to learn how to deal with it and how to manage it. This gripped confidence in economic development and had a paralyzing effect on politics and its decisions. It is now time to overcome this standstill. If we want the European project to regain the popular support that matches its importance, we need to tackle our challenges, both domestic and internationally, heads on. We need to be honest with ourselves. Just the idea of a strong and powerful European Union is not enough. The EU needs to deliver on its promise again. Whether it will be successful in doing so is up to all of us. I'm therefore counting on each and every one of you to play your part in this, whether as entrepreneurs working on new ways to power our industries, as politicians pushing forward the integration of the European single market, or, by the way, maybe as a banker or an engineer or an economist at the EIB one day. I would be delighted to welcome you to Luxembourg. By the way, Let's make it happen together. Too much is at stake. Thank you very much.
Very much, Dr. Hoyer. That was fascinating, very wide-ranging, and some of the history will, I'm sure, have been new to some people here. Just a couple of quick comments from me before I move to questions. I've already got a couple of questions in, which I'll feed to you very soon. But there were 2 points I was quite interested in. One was, which is quite depressing, and which I'm unfortunately can confirm from my bank, and that is that investment intentions are weak across Europe, and certainly in our case in the UK, and that is quite disappointing. But the secondly, when you talked about Euro-scepticism, I mean, it may seem odd for me to sound optimistic from the UK on Euro-scepticism, but actually, if you look at the age profile, in our referendum, the majority of under 25s who were in favour of staying in the European Union was massive. I mean, it was over 70%. And it was the people, sadly, of our age in the UK who voted 75%, the over 65s, to leave. So in the UK anyway, which you might regard as the kind of hotbed of Euroscepticism, it actually is not young people. It's the old, which is kind of a disappointing, but in some ways optimistic. The problem was, of course, and this is a lesson for students, and I often talk to my students, that the problem is that the proportion of young people who vote is small. And that if the proportion of under 30s in the UK who voted was the same as the proportion of the over 65s who voted, we'd still be in the European Union. But unfortunately, young people are somewhat disengaged. Anyway, those were just a couple of immediate reactions from me. Let me move straight into the questions. The first one is from Sean, who says, what incentives are there for EU oil and gas majors to move into becoming future renewables companies? For example, people with offshore drilling expertise developing into offshore wind farms. And is there something that the EIB can do in that area?
To be honest, I have not got the full second question because the sound is terrible, and maybe some of the engineers here can do something about it.
Shall I try again? Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Try again, please. The second part.
The second part of the question was, well, it was what incentives are there for EU oil and gas companies to move into the renewable sector? So, for example, people with expertise in offshore oil drilling may be developing into offshore wind farms. Is there something that the EIB can do to incentivize them in that way?
I don't know whether we can incentivize, but we can encourage politicians to set the incentives. The markets are doing it already. The markets are ahead of the political landscape. I had the discussion about investments in fossil fuel installations a couple of years and months ago. For instance, with big asset holders, insurance companies, and others. And it became clear in these talks that the move out of investments into fossil fuels is not something that is based on dreams or ideology or anything. It is based on good economics. One important asset manager of a huge Swiss bank told me that you have to be aware, if you invest into a fossil fuel energy installation, you will have that asset on your balance sheet for the next 30 or 40 years. But if you're honest, you know that in 15 years or 20 years, the latest, you'll have to write it off because of the economic and technological development. So if you do that as a public institution, you put it on, at the end of the day, on the shoulders of the taxpayers of that time. As a private institution, we would not go into investment with such a long tenure. And you'll see that, the head of BlackRock wrote a letter to the CEOs that he's cooperating with at the beginning of the year, warning against assets or new investments into assets that will be on the balance sheets too long. It will one day be stranded assets. And the avoidance of stranded assets is, in my view, good economics. On the other hand, if we avoid the investment into these stranded assets, then we must encourage investments into areas where uncertainty is still the name of the game. So this is why, even for a market economist like myself, it is necessary to come to some sort of an agreement between the public sector and the private sector on risk sharing. This has already been the idea behind the Juncker plan, the investment plan for Europe, where the situation was following. I need to tell the story because it's really indicative. Mr. Juncker at that time had not been re-elected as Prime Minister of Luxembourg, which was a shock because in the political science literature of Luxembourg it is not foreseen that a Juncker loses an election. So he was sitting in this Luxembourg-based EU bank in my office and said, I'm going to place a bid for the presidency of the European Commission for the European People's Party. And he said, what do I have to do in order to overcome this investment gap in Europe? He said, obviously, you have good ideas at the bank and with your partners, what to invest in. The money is abundantly available at almost zero interest rates in Frankfurt. So why does all this liquidity not flow into these projects? Obviously because of risk aversion. So people wanted to be reassured that somebody is ready to share a part of that risk. And that brought us to the development of the Juncker plan, which means that with a relatively small part of the EU budget, to give assurances that if something goes wrong, then we, with the EU budget, take the first hit, and you will not be sitting alone with the loss. So these kind of risk-sharing instruments, also patient capital investments, will be necessary to induce people to go into the unknown territory of the future and find out what the new technologies will be. This is where I think we should move, and we should do this, as I said, at a different point in my presentation, with a sense for technology neutrality, because neither the politicians in Westminster or in Paris or in Berlin are the ones who know which technology 10 years from now will be the dominating one. So let's be a little bit more humble and say we stick to technology neutrality.
Thank you. Let me go to the next question, which is from Rebecca, who says, if the EIB has decided to phase out fossil fuel support, what is the bank's stance on Nord Stream? Are there any EIB projects in place that would counterbalance it? Is the EU's support of the pipeline not a contradiction to its commitment to climate action and phasing out fossil fuels?
Had I not voluntarily given up my parliamentary seat and my seat at the cabinet table in Berlin, I would respond to that question forcefully. But in my present role, I better stay away from that political judgment. I would simply state the fact that EIB has never been involved in Nord Stream. And it is a political decision that the heads of state and government and the responsible ministers, together with the European Commission, need to come to a conclusion together. It's obviously nowadays a question of huge strategic importance, and I can only hope that we get it right. As I said, EIB is not and has never been involved in Nord Stream 2.
Thank you. That's very clear. The next question is from Dorian, who is a slightly more open question, but who asks you to talk a bit more about the EIB's Paris alignment strategy, especially for intermediated finance.
Well, Paris alignment means that everything we do is in accordance with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. That does not mean that every project we bring to the market is a climate project. What is important is we have committed by 2025 to arrive at 50% of the projects being climate and sustainability projects. That includes, by the way, biodiversity. It is important that the other 50% do not contradict the objectives of the first 50%. If with the second 50% of our lending we produce waste and dirty energies or whatever, then we destroy the effects of the first 50%. So what is important here is that with the second 50%, we do things which are, of course, following EU objectives, but are not necessarily climate projects, but they do not destroy or undermine the climate projects. Take, for instance, the development of the support for the development of vaccines. This is definitely not a climate project, but it does not undermine the climate ambitions either, and we are resolved to continue to invest into life science activities. But we must be very sure, and this has always been the problem with greenwashing, that we don't destroy with your one hand what you have built up with your other hand.
I've got another question in from Nina, who is one of my students actually. She says, I was wondering if you could explain a bit how the EIB is planning to integrate the EU taxonomy in its financing activities.
On the one hand, I could say, and I hear that at every business conference I go to, we are afraid of a bureaucratic monster that is going to be set up, and that scares the hell out of many entrepreneurs. On the other hand, I must say we have some experience with that, because in 2007, we brought the first green bonds to the market. That was very successful, much more than we had expected, and it had lots of followers on that, and we immediately found out that among these followers, there were people who were, to a large extent, quite active in greenwashing. And that, of course, cost a lot of credibility to the green bond issuances. So what we urgently needed at that time was an agreement about green standards, green bond standards. So we set up a working group in the European Union. We led it and gave a lot of input into this in order to arrive at a common standard for green bonds. And the same is now necessary for the taxonomy, because the taxonomy needs to go further, because we do not only finance nowadays green projects with special bonds. For instance, we have also other sustainable development goals that we support with targeted bond issuances, like education, for instance, very important. And therefore, we need a transparency vis-à-vis our investors, because they want to know what they invest into. Secondly, accountability and sustainability. And this is something that the European Union must now organize in the context of the taxonomy. I believe that will be a market success across the globe, because if we are of the opinion, and in my bank it is definitely a commonly shared opinion, that we will achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations only if we attract the private sector to co-finance these activities, then it means, on the other hand, that we need to have credibility in the issuance of the papers that we bring to the markets. And therefore, we need something like taxonomy. Unfortunately, the word taxonomy is about the worst that one could have invented, because some people are very good at ancient Greek and know what the word comes from and what taxes means in terms of order and system, while for somebody with English ears, it's probably a horror vision of having more taxes. This is the misunderstanding, for instance, in my own country, that taxonomy has something to do with taxes.
Many English people think it's to do with stuffing animals. They mix up taxonomy and taxidermy, but that's
exactly.
Could we move colour? I've got a question from Anna, who says, what would the EIB contribution be towards the European Commission's approach on the sustainable blue economy?
Well, we are heavily involved there. The blue economy is a key issue. We are participating in all these initiatives, conferences, and so forth. We have begun a couple of years ago with an initiative which we set up together with the promotional banks of France and Germany, Agence France de Développement and KfW. We call it the Clean Ocean Initiative. That's one of the first big issues where we try to contribute to the cleaning up of the ocean. But the blue economy activities are going far beyond that. And of course, the oceans and the water resources in general are not only our greatest wealth, but also, in my view, one of the most endangered parts of our heritage. And therefore, it needs to be center stage, and we don't differentiate, for instance, when it comes to bond issuance, whether this goes into the blue economy or into an air pollution project in Poland.
Thank you. I've got another one from Giacomo, which is back into the energy area, and he would like to know the EIB's view on nuclear energy in the context of Europe's decarbonisation.
Jesus Christ, it took more than 1 hour to arrive there. I'm totally surprised. You can imagine that the position of the EIB in this context is zero, because we are owned by 27 member states of the European Union, and they have totally conflicting views on nuclear energy. And I might have my own opinion, but that doesn't count at all. The fact is that the EIB has never been able to come to a common position on a nuclear project. I think we can probably arrive at constructive contributions when it comes to energy for nuclear security and things like that. But the promotion of nuclear energy itself, I think, is not foreseeable for activities of the European Investment Bank.
Thank you. I've now got one from Joaquin, who says, I was wondering whether the EIB is also interested in ensuring green investments and credit in southern European countries. Are the funds distributed in an equitable manner between north and south and east and west?
Well, I need to respond to that in a general way. We have to be present everywhere, and we have to be balanced. There is no doubt about that. But there are two things which are crystal clear. There is no quota thinking in the bank. So if a country has 5% of the shares of the bank, it is not entitled to have 5% of the green projects in that country. This is a no-go area. That would destroy the basic ideas of the European Investment Bank. And the second thing is there is no thinking in terms of juste retour. It cannot be, and this applies to other areas than the EU bank, that you say, well, I want to get out what I have put in. This is not the solidarity thinking that is behind the European idea, and also not the idea of making clear that what we achieve together is more than the sum of the individual contributions. So beyond that, of course, we always look that we are present everywhere. We sometimes need to go according to priorities. Take the green transition, for instance. It is easy for a country that has been out of fossil fuels for a long time already to contribute to be in favor of that policy. But if you still are, to a large extent, depending upon coal mining, for instance, and coal-produced energy, then you need to have a different approach there, and we need to help. You know, I always take the example of if the last coal miner who moves out of the coal pit in southern Silesia moves out there, he will need, or she, but probably he, will not be the head of a digital startup in 2 weeks. So we need to help with this transition, and that is a very, very ambitious task. And therefore, I'm particularly appreciative of those countries most affected by this change in basic guidelines for energy policy, because for them, the transition is the hardest. And therefore, I am strongly behind the European Commission's and the Council's idea about just transition. And that means some need us more than others, and we are committed to that.
Thank you. There's now a question on a slightly different topic, but I think also very interesting and relevant to what you've been talking about, which is, do the EIB finance, this is from Francesca, do the EIB finance also small-scale projects at the urban level? And what is the sort of minimum amount of money that the EIB will lend?
I didn't get the word. Did you say wholesale?
small scale
Small
projects.
scales. That's much better. Yes, there is the prejudice that the EIB, since its foundation in the Treaty of Rome in the 1950s and 57, is interested in big infrastructure projects only, and not only. No, that is not at all the case. We go down to the lowest level, and if a project is too small for EIB, then we leave it to our subsidiary, the European Investment Fund. And I would say, and we found out in the context of the discussion about data, that probably in view of the huge network of SME activities of the bank all across Europe and beyond, we are probably sitting on the biggest wealth of data about SMEs in the world. This is what we also discussed with our colleagues in the other multilateral development banks, because this is really a gem. This is a very, very useful asset we have there. And we are now moving into the sphere of artificial intelligence and real digitization of our work, because we do not simply exploit that knowledge about SMEs. And SMEs is by definition something that is normally relatively small and down to earth, and via the fund or via intermediaries like local banks or so, we are in that business as well. But then, of course, you should not ask me about the individual shop owners project that I couldn't say anything about. That requires then the intermediary or the fund to give your information about that. But the SME business is of highest importance, because SMEs are the backbones of most member states' industries.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end, the scheduled end. Do you mind, Dr. Hoyer, if we take, say, 2 more questions? Would that be okay by you?
Definitely.
Right. Well, one is from Charlotte, which is the EIB planning to invest in renewables in Africa, especially with regard to imports of green hydrogen to Europe in the future? You said that investments for clean hydrogen must be unlocked. What is the position of the EIB towards blue hydrogen?
We are absolutely open. And whenever something is on our way that is technologically interesting, we do not close our eyes. When it comes to renewable energies in Africa, we have been on that market for decades. If you look at the huge solar projects in Morocco and other places, EIB projects. So this is nothing new for us. And in particular when it comes to green hydrogen, because the green hydrogen solution is of key importance for all of us. But this requires huge amounts of electricity available, because you need to produce this stuff and make it transportable. And this requires a multiplication of the energy supply for Africa, and I talked about it before, that with the current technologies would lead to more CO2 emissions than before. So we need really to move courageously into the development of renewable energies in order to be able to produce this electrolysis.
Thank you. We take one last question, and this is from Baptiste, which is, how does the EIB deal with firms which finance both the green and the brown economies? So he gives the example of Total, obviously an oil major, but also financing some green projects. Does the global profile of firms count in your decisions on investing in projects? And how do you look at the sort of ethics and impact of the firms you're prepared to invest with?
A critical situation, because on the one hand, you do not want by the back door to finance projects which are not clean or contributing to an improvement of the ecological situation. On the one hand, you are happy that that companies who have been very active in non-green activities for years and decades now detect the green sphere, and if we can help them to get there, that's a good development as well. So we have to be sure that this is a steady course that they are pursuing, and that, well, like the Lord is always happy about the one who come back to the path of truth than those about who are super Catholic from the beginning and then begin to sin. So this is the approach we basically have on this. But we want to be reassured that we do not finance dirty stuff through the back door.
Well, thank you very much for all of those very clear and succinct answers, and thanks to the students for putting in their questions. There were one or two others, but which were roughly of the same sort, so I've sort of grouped them a little bit. But I found that personally a fascinating exposition of what the EIB does, and it would have been extremely useful for more bankers to hear it, as well as for the students. But thank you so much for coming along to PSIA. It was an honor for us, and we're very grateful for your time this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to you and your moderation of the whole thing, to the students for their participation and great interest. And as I said at the beginning, I hope to see maybe a bigger group of students and faculty in Luxembourg very soon. I have always second thoughts about it because we need good people. Welcome to Luxembourg.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.
Sciences Po.